Gabby was 20 minutes away from walking down the aisle when she heard the groom laughing with his friends through an open window. At first, she wasn't paying attention. Then one sentence froze her in place. "I never loved her. She's just good for my image." The man waiting at the altar, the man about to promise forever, had been planning the entire marriage as part of a strategy. Gabby stood there in silence, listening as the truth kept spilling out. In that moment, she had a choice. Break down. Call off the wedding, or do something that would leave every guest in that oceanfront venue stunned. And the decision she made changed everything. Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always do my best to give you the best as I learn and improve every day. If this is your first time watching my video, please comment below with where you're watching from, and hit subscribe to officially join the family. Now let me tell you about Gabrielle Johnson, the woman who learned a life lesson 20 minutes before her wedding. Florida has a way of blending very different worlds into the same stretch of sunlight. Palm trees sway beside old brick churches. Luxury boats glide across the water not far from neighborhoods where people sit on folding chairs outside their homes, talking long after the sun goes down. The air carries salt from the coast and the smell of barbecue smoke drifting through backyards. Gabrielle Johnson grew up right in the middle of that mixture. Everyone called her Gabby. She was raised in Tampa in a close black community where neighbors greeted each other by name and privacy was more of a suggestion than a rule. If someone got a new car, the whole block knew by dinner time. If someone argued with their partner, somebody's auntie had already heard about it before the argument ended. Gabby didn't mind that kind of environment. In fact, it shaped the way she saw the world. People revealed themselves when they thought nobody was paying attention, and Gabby paid attention. Her grandmother used to sit on the small porch every evening once the heat softened. The old wooden chair creaked whenever she leaned back, watching people pass by the house. Gabby often sat on the steps beside her. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. One evening when Gabby was about 12, she noticed her grandmother quietly studying a couple walking down the street. The man was talking loudly, waving his hands as if he were explaining something important. The woman beside him kept nodding, but her smile looked tight. Gabby squinted. "They arguing?" she asked. Her grandmother didn't answer right away. She waited until the couple turned the corner and disappeared from view. Then she said calmly, "Baby, people show you who they are. Most folks just too busy being in love to see it." Gabby frowned. "They looked fine to me." Her grandmother smiled slightly. That man was talking, but that woman wasn't listening. She was surviving the conversation. Gabby blinked. She hadn't noticed that. Her grandmother leaned forward and tapped the step gently with her finger. "Watch people long enough," she said, "and the truth always finds its way out." That sentence stayed with Gabby longer than either of them realized. Growing up in that neighborhood meant life was always filled with gatherings. Church on Sundays, family reunions in the park, birthday parties where music played so loudly the neighbors sometimes joined the celebration whether they were invited or not. Gabby loved those moments, not just the laughter or the food, though both were always abundant. She loved watching how people behaved when emotions were involved. At church weddings, she noticed how nervous grooms wiped their hands against their suits before the ceremony. At baby showers, she saw the way proud grandmothers held their heads a little higher. At family cookouts, she noticed which couples stood close together and which ones kept quiet distance between them. While other kids were running around chasing each other through the yard, Gabby often sat nearby observing everything. Her cousins teased her about it. "You always studying people," one of them said once. Gabby shrugged. "People interesting." Her grandmother overheard that and laughed. "Nothing wrong with paying attention," she said. "That skill will save you from a lot of trouble." By the time Gabby reached her late teens, she understood something important. Moments mattered. The gatherings she grew up around weren't just celebrations. They were turning points in people's lives. A wedding changed two families forever. A graduation marked years of effort finally paying off. Even a simple birthday party could become a memory someone carried for the rest of their life. Gabby didn't have the language for it yet, but she understood the emotional weight of those moments. She also understood something else. Those events didn't organize themselves. Someone always worked behind the scenes making sure everything ran smoothly. Someone coordinated food, music, decorations, schedules. And when that person did their job well, the event felt effortless. Gabby started helping wherever she could. At church, she volunteered to arrange chairs before gatherings. At family reunions, she helped coordinate games and activities for younger kids. At neighborhood events, she organized decorations while adults prepared food. People began noticing her natural sense for timing and organization. "She keeps things running better than most grown folks," someone once joked during a church event. Gabby laughed it off. But deep inside, a quiet idea was beginning to form. She enjoyed bringing people together. Not just for the celebration itself, but for the feeling those moments created. The laughter, the shared memories, the sense of connection. Without realizing it, the path toward her future was slowly taking shape. Gabby wasn't just observing people anymore. She was learning how to create the spaces where their most important moments could unfold. And that skill, understanding both people and emotions, would eventually open doors she never expected, including the door that would bring Declan Mercer into her life. But that part of the story was still years away. For now, Gabby was simply a young woman growing up in Tampa, listening, watching, and learning that the truth about people always appears, if you pay close enough attention. By the time Gabrielle Johnson reached her mid-20s, people in Tampa had started noticing something about her. Events simply ran better when Gabby was involved. It didn't matter if it was a church anniversary celebration, a birthday gathering in someone's backyard, or a formal engagement dinner. If Gabby organized it, things flowed smoothly. Guests arrived on time, food appeared exactly when it should, and somehow everyone left feeling like the day had mattered. At first, she treated it like a helpful habit, something she was good at. But over time, the requests kept growing. A friend asked her to coordinate a wedding reception. Then someone at church recommended her to another family planning a large anniversary celebration. That event led to a referral for a community fundraiser. Gabby eventually realized something. This wasn't just a hobby anymore. One evening, she sat at her small dining table, surrounded by notebooks filled with event ideas, vendor contacts, and decoration sketches. The ceiling fan turned slowly above her while she studied the pages. Her cousin leaned over her shoulder. "You building a whole business over here?" Gabby smiled. "Maybe." Her cousin laughed. "Maybe. Girl, you already running half the events in this neighborhood." Gabby didn't argue with that. Instead, she picked up her pen and wrote something at the top of a clean page. Gabrielle Johnson Events. The name looked simple, but the decision behind it was serious. Gabby officially started her event planning company that year. At first, most of her work came from the communities she had always known. Church weddings filled with gospel music and proud families dressed in bright colors. Graduation celebrations where cousins argued over the best playlist while aunties made sure everyone ate at least twice. Family reunions held in parks where folding tables overflowed with homemade food. Gabby loved those events. They were loud, joyful, and full of personality. People laughed easily. Kids ran through the grass while older relatives told stories about things that happened years ago. But as her reputation grew, something unexpected started happening. People from outside her usual circles began calling. One of her early clients recommended her to a corporate foundation planning a fundraising dinner. That event introduced her to donors and community leaders who attended regularly. Soon, Gabby found herself planning a completely different type of gathering. Quiet charity auctions held inside elegant venues. Formal dinners where guests spoke in careful voices while servers carried trays of expensive wine. Luxury beachfront weddings where the bride arrived in a vintage car and photographers followed every movement. The environments felt different from the celebrations she grew up around. But Gabby adjusted easily. She understood people. Whether someone was wearing designer clothing or a church hat decorated with feathers, emotions worked the same way. Weddings still carried nervous excitement. Families still brought their complicated histories into the room. Gabby treated every event with the same attention. She listened closely when couples explained what they wanted their wedding to feel like. She noticed the small details others overlooked. If a bride looked anxious during rehearsal, Gabby found ways to calm the room before the ceremony began. If family members seemed tense around each other, she adjusted seating arrangements to prevent awkward moments. That ability quickly became her greatest strength. People trusted her, not just because she organized beautiful events, but because she understood the emotional weight behind them. One evening, after finishing a large charity fundraiser along the waterfront, a guest approached her while the staff packed up decorations. "I've attended events all over Florida," the woman said. "Yours feel different." Gabby tilted her head slightly. "How so?" The woman smiled. People actually relax. Gabby laughed softly. That's the goal. More referrals followed. Within a few years, Gabrielle Johnson Events had grown into a respected name in Tampa's event scene. Friends started joking that Gabby had a social passport. On Friday nights, she might be laughing with cousins over dominoes and barbecue, while music played through backyard speakers. By Saturday morning, she could be coordinating a luxury wedding where guests arrived in tailored suits and polished shoes. 2 different worlds, 2 different energies. But Gabby moved between them with natural ease. Through all that growth, she kept one personal rule firmly in place. It was a rule she rarely talked about, but it guided many of her decisions. Gabby never mixed business with love. Planning weddings had taught her something important about relationships. They looked beautiful from the outside. But behind the decorations and photographs, real partnerships required trust, honesty, and emotional maturity. Gabby had seen enough complicated couples during her work to understand how fragile those things could be. So she kept her professional life and her romantic life separate. Work stayed professional. Love stayed personal. Simple. Or at least, that was the rule she believed would always protect her. What Gabby didn't realize yet was that life had already begun preparing a challenge to that rule. Because very soon, one of the biggest clients Gabrielle Johnson Events would ever take on was a man named Declan Mercer. By the time Gabrielle Johnson Events had been operating for a few years, Gabby had built a quiet reputation around Tampa. Not the loud kind that comes with billboards or flashy advertising, the kind that spreads through conversations. A bride recommending her to a friend, a family member mentioning her name during a church gathering, a business leader passing along her contact after attending a well-run fundraiser. That's how most of her work arrived, one recommendation at a time. One afternoon, her phone rang while she was reviewing seating charts at her office desk. The number wasn't familiar. Gabrielle Johnson Events, she answered. A calm male voice responded. Good afternoon. I'm calling on behalf of Mercer Development Group. Gabby leaned back slightly in her chair. The name sounded familiar. We're planning a charity fundraiser connected to a redevelopment project here in Tampa, the voice continued. Your company was recommended to us. Gabby grabbed a pen. I'd be happy to discuss it. They scheduled a planning meeting for later that week at the waterfront venue where the fundraiser would take place. Gabby arrived early, like she always did. The building overlooked the bay, with tall windows that allowed sunlight to spill across the polished floors. Staff members moved through the room, arranging tables while Gabby checked vendor notes on her clipboard. Catering needs another service table near the west entrance, she said to one of her assistants. The assistant nodded and walked off to handle it. Gabby continued reviewing the layout. A moment later, she sensed someone standing nearby. She didn't immediately look up. Instead, she finished writing one last note before lifting her eyes. The man standing in front of her was tall, dressed in a tailored navy suit that fit him like it had been designed specifically for his frame. His posture was relaxed but confident. He looked like someone used to being listened to. He offered a small smile. Gabrielle Johnson, right? Gabby closed her clipboard. Gabby is fine. He extended his hand. Declan Mercer. The name clicked instantly. Mercer Development Group. She had heard about the company several times while working charity events around Florida. Large coastal projects, luxury residential developments, redevelopment investments in growing neighborhoods. Gabby shook his hand. His handshake was firm but not aggressive. I've heard you're the best planner in this part of the state, Declan said. Gabby raised an eyebrow. You heard that from someone who already paid the deposit? Declan laughed, quietly. That obvious. Gabby smiled slightly. People usually compliment the planner after the contract is signed. Fair point, he admitted. The conversation that followed began with business. Venue logistics, guest capacity, catering coordination, media presence for the fundraiser. Declan listened carefully as Gabby explained her ideas for organizing the event flow. Unlike some clients she worked with, he didn't interrupt or try to take control of the conversation. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions. How will guests move between the reception area and the main stage? He asked at one point. Gabby gestured toward the room layout. We'll open the side entrance once the speeches begin. That keeps traffic flowing without interrupting the program. Declan nodded slowly. That's smart. The meeting lasted nearly an hour. By the time they finished reviewing the plan, most of the staff had already left for the afternoon. Gabby gathered her papers and prepared to leave. But as she walked toward the door, Declan spoke again. You run a tight operation. Gabby glanced back. I try to. No, he said, shaking his head slightly. You do. She studied him for a moment. There was something calm about him. Not flashy, not overly charming, just composed. Most men she met in professional spaces tried too hard to impress people around them. Declan didn't seem interested in that. What made you get into event planning? He asked. Gabby leaned lightly against the table. My aunt used to organize church events when I was younger. I watched how people came together around those moments. She shrugged. Weddings, reunions, celebrations. Declan waited for her to continue. People think events are about decorations, Gabby said finally. They're really about emotions. Declan's smile widened slightly. That might be the smartest explanation I've heard all week. Gabby chuckled. Most people only notice the flowers. They talked for a few more minutes. About Tampa. About how quickly Florida's coastal cities were growing. About the strange way communities could change when development projects arrived. Despite their different backgrounds, the conversation felt easy, natural. When Gabby finally checked the time, she realized nearly 20 minutes had passed since the meeting officially ended. She straightened. Well, I should get going. Declan nodded. Of course. Gabby picked up her bag and turned toward the exit. Then Declan spoke again. Would you like to get dinner sometime? Gabby stopped. Slowly she turned back to him. You're asking the event planner who just spent the last hour making sure your fundraiser doesn't fall apart? Declan smiled. Exactly. Gabby studied him carefully. She had met plenty of charming men during her years planning events. Most of them tried too hard. Declan felt different. Steady. Calm. Still, she had a rule. Never mix business with love. Gabby crossed her arms slightly. You're aware that's usually a bad idea, right? Declan shrugged lightly. Some risks are worth asking about. Gabby held his gaze for another second. Then she surprised herself. She smiled. All right. Declan's expression softened. Friday night. Gabby picked up her clipboard again as she walked toward the door. Text me the details. She stepped outside into the warm Tampa sunlight, unaware that the simple dinner invitation she had just accepted was the beginning of a relationship that would one day bring her to an oceanfront wedding aisle, and a truth waiting only minutes before she was supposed to say, I do. The first few weeks after that dinner invitation passed more easily than either Gabrielle Johnson or Declan Mercer expected. Their first date had been simple. Declan chose a quiet restaurant overlooking a marina, just outside downtown Tampa. Boats rocked gently against the docks while the evening sky faded from orange into deep blue. Gabby arrived 10 minutes early out of habit. Declan was already there. That alone made her smile. Most men she had dated in the past believed arriving late somehow made them look important. Declan simply stood when she approached the table. You beat me here, she said. He smiled slightly. I had a feeling you might be early. Dinner stretched into hours of conversation. They talked about Tampa, about the strange pace of Florida's growth, about the way neighborhoods changed over time. Gabby told stories about weddings she had coordinated where families reunited after years of tension. Declan shared experiences from development projects where entire communities argued over how their cities should evolve. By the time they left the restaurant, neither of them had checked their phones once. That was rare. More dinners followed. Then weekend drives along the coast. Then quiet evenings where conversation moved easily between serious topics and harmless jokes. For Gabby, the relationship felt steady. Declan didn't rush things. He didn't pressure her. He seemed comfortable simply getting to know her. Eventually, the time came for him to meet the other side of Gabby's world. It happened on a Saturday afternoon during a family cookout. Music drifted through the backyard while a grill smoked steadily near the patio. Folding chairs surrounded plastic tables covered with homemade food. Someone had already started a domino game near the porch. Gabby stepped through the gate with Declan beside her. Welcome, she said, glancing around the yard, to the real test. Declan laughed quietly. I've survived boardroom meetings with investors. How bad can this be? Gabby tilted her head toward the domino table. That group right there has no mercy. Declan followed her through the yard while several relatives immediately noticed them. One voice called out from the grill. Gabby, you brought company. Gabby smiled. This is Declan. Declan nodded politely. Nice to meet everyone. Within minutes, someone handed him a plate of food, while another relative asked him where he was from. A cousin started teasing Gabby about finally bringing a man around. The energy was loud, warm, and full of movement. At first, Declan looked slightly unsure where to stand or who to speak to, but Gabby noticed something about him. He didn't try to dominate the space. He listened. When someone spoke, he leaned in and paid attention. When someone joked with him, he laughed naturally instead of forcing it. Eventually, he ended up sitting near the domino table while several cousins tried explaining the rules. Gabby watched from across the yard. "You studying him?" a familiar voice asked quietly beside her. Gabby glanced over. Her grandmother had been sitting near the porch the entire time. Gabby smiled. "Just making sure he behaves." Her grandmother followed Gabby's gaze toward Declan. Declan was listening carefully while one cousin explained the game, nodding politely even though the explanation was clearly confusing. The older woman watched silently for a moment. Then she said softly, "He's polite." Gabby crossed her arms. "That's good, right?" Her grandmother didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and continued observing. Declan laughed as someone accused him of cheating during the domino game. Finally, the older woman spoke again. "Polite don't tell you everything." Gabby sighed playfully. "Grandma." Her grandmother turned toward her with the calm expression Gabby had seen her use many times before. "Baby, watch a man long enough. The truth always shows up." Gabby shook her head. "You always say that because it's always true." Across the yard, Declan stood and carried empty plates toward the trash bin without being asked. Someone thanked him, while another relative clapped him on the shoulder. He was adjusting, slowly but comfortably. Gabby watched him for another moment before smiling. "You see that?" she said. Her grandmother nodded. "I see it." Gabby waited. "And?" she asked. The older woman shrugged. "He's making a good first impression." Gabby laughed. "That sounds like approval." Her grandmother raised one eyebrow. "It sounds like observation." Later that evening, after most of the food had disappeared and the music had softened, Declan and Gabby walked toward the gate together. Declan exhaled as they stepped onto the sidewalk. That was an experience. Gabby laughed. "You survived." He looked back toward the yard, where laughter still echoed from the porch. "Your family has energy. That's one word for it." Declan smiled thoughtfully. "You know what I like about it?" "What?" "It feels real." Gabby studied him quietly for a moment, because that word mattered to her. Real. If someone couldn't handle her world, the relationship would never last. But watching Declan laugh with her cousins earlier had eased something inside her. For the first time since their first dinner together, Gabby allowed herself to consider something. Maybe this relationship had real potential. Maybe Declan Mercer could fit into her life. What she didn't know yet was that relationships sometimes look strongest in the beginning, long before the truth has a chance to show itself. A few weeks after Declan spent that afternoon at Gabby's family cookout, he invited her to something very different. "Dinner on Thursday," he said, while they sat together on her couch one evening. "There's a small gathering I'd like you to come to." Gabby raised an eyebrow. "What kind of gathering?" Declan leaned back slightly. "Mostly business people, some investors, a few community partners." Gabby smiled knowingly. "So this is the other side of your life." Declan returned the smile. "You've already seen the casual version. Now you get the formal one." Gabby laughed softly. "All right, I'll behave." Thursday evening arrived with a warm breeze rolling in from the bay. Declan picked her up just after sunset and drove toward a private waterfront club in Sarasota. The building overlooked rows of boats tied neatly along the marina. Soft lighting glowed through the large windows, and valet attendants greeted guests as cars arrived. Gabby stepped out of the car wearing a deep emerald dress that moved lightly with the breeze. Declan paused for a second. "You look incredible." Gabby smiled. "Relax. I clean up well." Inside, the room felt calm and controlled. Conversations happened in small circles. Glasses clinked gently as servers moved through the crowd with trays of drinks. It was a different energy than the lively gatherings Gabby grew up around. Quieter, measured, Declan greeted several people as they walked through the room. Each handshake seemed familiar, practiced. "Declan," one man said warmly. "Good to see you." "You too," Declan replied. Then he gestured toward Gabby. "This is Gabrielle Johnson." Gabby extended her hand politely. "Gabby is fine." The man nodded. "Pleasure to meet you." More introductions followed. Investors, attorneys, people connected to development projects along Florida's coast. Gabby listened carefully as conversations moved between property markets, construction timelines, and investment strategies. Eventually, everyone gathered around a long dining table overlooking the water. Declan sat beside her. Across the table, one of the older men leaned forward slightly. "So Gabby," he said, "Declan tells us you run an event planning company." "I do," she replied calmly. "Weddings mostly?" "Weddings, fundraisers, community events," Gabby said. "Anything that brings people together." The man nodded slowly. "Interesting field." His tone held a quiet curiosity that Gabby noticed immediately. She smiled politely. "It's more complicated than people think." "How so?" another guest asked. Gabby took a sip of water before answering. "Events bring together people who don't always interact in everyday life." Several guests leaned in slightly. "Families with history," she continued. "Different personalities, expectations, emotions." She shrugged lightly. "When those things meet in one room, you learn a lot about people." Declan glanced at her with quiet amusement. The older man nodded thoughtfully. "Well," he said, "let's hope Declan's future wedding runs smoothly then." Several guests laughed. Declan lifted his glass. "With Gabby planning it, I'm confident it will." The group toasted. But Gabby noticed something subtle in the room. A few people exchanged quick glances when the subject of marriage came up. Not rude, just curious, almost as if they were studying how she fit into Declan's life. Later that evening, as guests slowly began leaving, Gabby and Declan stepped outside near the marina. The night air felt cooler after the quiet formality of the dinner. Gabby leaned against the railing overlooking the water. "That was interesting," she said. Declan chuckled. "Too formal?" "Different," she replied honestly. He studied her expression. "Did it bother you?" Gabby shook her head. "No, just a different rhythm." Declan nodded. "That world can feel a little stiff sometimes." Gabby glanced at him. "You move through it comfortably. I grew up around it." They stood there quietly for a moment while boats rocked gently in the dark water. Then Gabby spoke again. "Some of them were studying me." Declan didn't deny it. That happens when someone new enters a room. Gabby smiled slightly. "I noticed." Declan turned toward her. "You handled it well. I handle rooms for a living." He laughed. "That's true." For a moment the conversation faded into comfortable silence. The lights from the marina reflected across the water while the sky darkened above them. Then Declan reached for her hand. "Walk with me," he said. They moved along the quiet shoreline where the sand stretched out beneath the fading light. The sun had almost disappeared when Declan suddenly stopped. Gabby turned. "What is it?" Declan looked nervous for the first time since she had known him, which immediately made her suspicious. "You all right?" she asked. He took a slow breath. "I've spent most of my life building things," he said. Gabby folded her arms. "That sounds like the beginning of a speech." Declan smiled slightly. "Maybe." He reached into his jacket pocket. Gabby's eyes widened. "Wait." Declan dropped down onto one knee. The ring caught the last glow of the sunset. "Gabrielle Johnson," he said quietly, "will you marry me?" For a moment, the entire beach seemed to fall silent. Gabby stared at him, then at the ring, then back at him again. "You're serious right now?" Declan nodded. "Very." Gabby shook her head slowly, almost laughing in disbelief. "You know my grandmother is going to interrogate you. I'm ready. My cousins might challenge you to dominoes again." "I'll practice." Gabby looked at him for another long second. Then a smile slowly spread across her face. "Yes." Declan exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath for minutes. "Yes?" he asked. "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. Gabby looked down at it as the last light disappeared across the water. For that moment, everything felt genuine. The love, the promise, the future they imagined together. And Gabby truly believed she had just said yes to the right man. The weeks after the engagement passed in a blur of excitement. For someone who had spent years planning weddings for other people, Gabrielle Johnson suddenly found herself on the other side of the process. Friends kept joking about it, the event planner finally planning her own wedding. One of her cousins laughed during a phone call. Gabby smiled every time she heard that, because she approached her own wedding the same way she approached every event she managed. Organized, calm and practical. She created timelines, contacted vendors, sketched layouts for the ceremony and reception. Declan watched her work one evening while she sat at her dining table surrounded by folders. "You're treating this like a business project," he teased. Gabby didn't look up from her notes. "That's because weddings fall apart when people rely on excitement instead of planning." Declan leaned against the kitchen counter with a smile. "I trust you." Gabby glanced at him. "Good. Because you hired the best planner in Tampa." He laughed. For a while, everything felt natural. They talked about the future often. Declan shared ideas about expanding some of his redevelopment projects across Florida's west coast. Gabby spoke about growing Gabrielle Johnson events into something bigger, maybe even coordinating destination weddings one day. Their conversations felt hopeful, balanced, but slowly, small changes began appearing. At first, they were so subtle that Gabby barely noticed them. Declan started taking more phone calls than usual. Sometimes they happened while they were watching television together. His phone would vibrate, and he would step outside onto the balcony to answer it. "Work," he would say when he came back inside. Gabby didn't question it. Real estate development involved large investments and constant negotiations. Late calls didn't feel unusual for someone managing projects that size. Still, the pattern continued. One evening they were having dinner at Declan's house when his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and stood up. "I need to take this." Gabby nodded. "No problem." She continued eating while he stepped outside onto the patio. Through the glass door she could see him pacing slowly while he spoke in a low voice. His expression looked serious. When he came back inside, he forced a small smile. "Sorry about that." Gabby shrugged. "Everything okay?" "Just business." She accepted the answer. Trust has a quiet way of protecting itself. When you believe someone cares about you, your mind often searches for reasons to dismiss small doubts. Another change appeared a few days later. Declan mentioned that he needed to travel unexpectedly for a meeting connected to one of his projects. "Just a quick trip," he explained while packing a bag. Gabby leaned against the doorway. "Where?" "Miami." She raised an eyebrow. "That's a long drive. Important investors." Gabby nodded. "All right." He kissed her goodbye and left early the next morning. When he returned the following evening, he looked tired but relaxed. "How did it go?" she asked. "Productive," he replied. The answer seemed simple enough. Gabby moved on without thinking much about it. But a few days later, something unusual happened. Gabby had stopped by Declan's house unexpectedly after finishing a client meeting nearby. She still had a folder in her hand when she walked into the kitchen. "Declan?" she called. No response. The house was quiet. She stepped further inside and noticed his phone resting on the kitchen counter. At that exact moment, the screen lit up with a new message. Gabby didn't mean to read it, but the words appeared clearly before she could look away. "Are you sure this is going to work?" She frowned slightly. A second message followed almost immediately. "You said once the wedding happens, everything will be set." Gabby stared at the screen. Her mind immediately began searching for explanations. Business negotiation, contract discussion, something related to one of his projects. Before she could think further, the back door opened. Declan walked inside and stopped when he saw her standing in the kitchen. "Gabby." She turned, quickly. "Hey." His eyes flicked toward the phone on the counter. "You've been here long?" he asked. "Just a minute." Declan walked over casually and picked up the phone. "Work messages," he said. Gabby nodded. She wanted to believe that explanation, and at that moment she chose to. They talked for a few minutes about wedding details before Declan suggested ordering dinner. The evening continued normally. Laughter, conversation, plans for the ceremony. But later that night, after Gabby returned home, something unusual happened. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling in the quiet darkness. The house felt still, peaceful, yet her mind kept returning to the words she had seen on Declan's phone. "Once the wedding happens, everything will be set." Gabby rolled onto her side and looked at the engagement ring resting on her finger. For the first time since saying yes to Declan Mercer, a question appeared in her mind, just a small one. But questions have a strange way of growing once they exist. And somewhere deep inside her instincts, those same instincts her grandmother once encouraged, something was beginning to stir. Not certainty, not accusation, just a quiet sense that something, somewhere, might not be exactly what it seemed. Several months passed between the engagement and the final weeks before the wedding. For most couples, that period would have been filled with stress, but Gabrielle Johnson handled wedding preparation the way she handled every event she planned. Methodically. Schedules were organized, vendors confirmed, decorations selected. She refused to allow chaos near something as important as her own ceremony. Declan seemed impressed watching her manage everything. "You make this look easy," he said one evening while they reviewed venue layouts together. Gabby smiled. "It only looks easy because I've been doing it for years." He shook his head. "Remind me never to underestimate you." She laughed. "That's a good rule for anyone." Around that time, Declan invited her to another dinner with several of his professional associates. The venue overlooked a quiet marina along Florida's west coast. The restaurant was elegant without feeling overly formal. Soft lighting reflected off the water outside while boats rocked gently along the docks. Gabby arrived with Declan shortly after sunset. Inside, several people were already seated around a long table near the windows. Declan greeted them comfortably. "Good evening." One of the men stood to shake his hand. "Declan, glad you made it." Then the man looked toward Gabby. "And this must be Gabrielle." Gabby offered a polite smile. "Gabby is fine." She took the seat beside Declan while servers brought drinks and menus. The conversation started easily enough. Development projects, economic growth in coastal cities, local politics. Gabby listened quietly while the discussion moved between topics. She was used to environments like this by now. But something about the tone of the evening felt slightly different. People seemed curious about her. Not rude, just observant. Eventually, one of the older men leaned back in his chair and looked directly at Gabby. "So, you're the famous event planner Declan keeps mentioning." Gabby chuckled lightly. "I don't know about famous. Well, we've heard good things." "Thank you." Another guest smiled. "Weddings, right?" "Weddings, fundraisers, community events," Gabby replied. The man nodded slowly. "That's quite a contrast from Declan's world." Gabby tilted her head slightly. "How so?" "Well," he said, gesturing casually around the table, "we deal mostly in contracts and construction timelines." Gabby smiled calmly. "People are still involved in those." The table laughed softly. Declan glanced at her with quiet admiration, but the older man continued studying her. "You certainly bring character to the picture." Gabby paused slightly. "Character?" He nodded. "Yes." "It's interesting." Gabby kept her smile, but the phrase lingered in her mind. Character to the picture, not partner, not future wife. Picture. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Gabby found herself replaying the comment. Glanced toward Declan briefly. He seemed relaxed, listening to someone explain details about an upcoming development project. For the rest of the evening, Gabby participated politely in the discussion. Yet something inside her had shifted. Not suspicion, exactly, just awareness. When dinner ended and guests began leaving, Declan and Gabby walked outside toward the marina. The night air felt cooler than inside the restaurant. Declan stretched his arms slightly. "Good evening," he said. Gabby nodded. "It was." He looked at her. "You're quiet." Gabby leaned lightly against the railing overlooking the water. "Just thinking." "About what?" She hesitated for a moment. Then she shrugged. "Your friend said, I bring character to the picture." Declan chuckled. "That sounds like him." Gabby studied the water for a second before speaking again. What did he mean by that? Declan waved his hand dismissively. "Nothing important." "Still," she said calmly, "it sounded like he was describing a business strategy." Declan laughed softly. "You're reading too much into it." "Maybe she..." Gabby nodded and let the subject drop. But as they walked back toward the car, that word remained in her thoughts. Picture. For the first time since becoming engaged to Declan Mercer, Gabby wondered if there were parts of his world she still didn't fully understand. And sometimes the first warning doesn't arrive as a clear problem. Sometimes it arrives as a single sentence that stays in your mind long after the conversation ends. As the wedding date moved closer, Gabrielle Johnson's life became increasingly busy. That was expected. Even though she had planned hundreds of events, coordinating her own wedding while still managing client work meant her schedule rarely slowed down. Some days began before sunrise and didn't end until late evening. Declan seemed supportive of the pace. Whenever she apologized for being distracted by wedding details or business calls, he brushed it off. "You're good at what you do," he would say. "I knew that when I met you." For the most part, their relationship still felt steady. They spent evenings discussing honeymoon plans and future goals. Gabby sometimes talked about expanding her company beyond Tampa, maybe even opening a second office someday. Declan encouraged those ideas, but the quiet sense of uncertainty that had begun earlier hadn't completely disappeared. It lingered in the background of her thoughts, subtle enough that she could ignore it most of the time. Then something happened that made that feeling harder to dismiss. It was a Thursday evening about 2 weeks before the wedding. Gabby had spent most of the afternoon meeting with a florist and confirming final arrangements for the ceremony venue. By the time she returned home, she was exhausted. Her phone buzzed with a message from Declan. "Running late tonight." Meeting went longer than expected. Gabby read the text while kicking off her shoes. "No problem," she replied. "Don't work too hard." She set the phone down and went to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. Work meetings running late was nothing unusual for Declan. Development projects often required long negotiations and unpredictable schedules. Gabby didn't give the message another thought. Later that evening, she sat at her dining table reviewing seating arrangements for the wedding reception. Her assistant had sent updated guest lists, and Gabby wanted to double-check every detail. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from one of the assistants who helped her coordinate larger events. "Gabby, is this Declan?" A link followed. Gabby tapped the link without thinking much about it. The screen opened to a photo posted from a networking event earlier that evening. The caption mentioned a real estate gathering in Miami. Gabby leaned closer to the screen. In the background of the photo stood a group of men talking near a display table. One of them was Declan. Her stomach tightened slightly. Miami. That was nearly 4 hours from Tampa. She scrolled through the post again to make sure she wasn't mistaken. It was definitely him. Gabby sat back in her chair. Her mind immediately returned to the message he had sent earlier. "Running late tonight." Meeting went longer than expected. No mention of travel, no mention of Miami, just a vague explanation. She stared at the photo again. There could be a simple explanation. Maybe the trip had come together quickly. Maybe he didn't want to bother her while she was busy with wedding preparations. Gabby placed the phone on the table and tried to return her attention to the seating chart in front of her. But the numbers and names on the page suddenly felt harder to focus on. Her instincts were speaking again, not loudly, just quietly, the same way they had during the marina dinner. She picked up her phone again and opened the message Declan had sent earlier. Then she looked at the timestamp on the photo from Miami. They were posted at almost the same time. Gabby took a slow breath. She didn't send another message asking about it. Instead, she closed the photo and set the phone down. Later that night, Declan called her. His voice sounded relaxed. "Long day?" he asked. Gabby leaned back on the couch. "You could say that." "I finally wrapped up the meeting," he said. "Sorry I wasn't able to talk earlier." Gabby listened carefully. There was no mention of travel, no explanation about being in another city, just the same simple story about a meeting running late. "How did it go?" she asked. "Productive," Declan replied. "We made good progress." Gabby nodded even though he couldn't see her. "That's good." The conversation continued normally after that. They talked about the wedding schedule and what time guests would start arriving the next week. Declan even joked about how nervous he expected to feel standing at the altar. Gabby laughed with him. But after the call ended, she remained sitting quietly on the couch. Her phone rested in her hand while the photo from Miami replayed in her thoughts. She didn't accuse him of anything. She didn't confront him. Not yet. But the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. First, the strange messages she saw on his phone. Then the subtle comments from people in his professional circle. Now a trip that had never been mentioned. Gabby stood and walked slowly toward her bedroom. When she reached the mirror, she paused and studied her reflection. Her grandmother's voice returned to her memory again. "Watch a man long enough. The truth always shows up." Gabby exhaled quietly. She wasn't ready to draw conclusions. But one thing was becoming clear. The small questions she had been ignoring were beginning to multiply. And sometimes the most important warnings arrive not through loud discoveries, but through the quiet moments when a story stops adding up. The week before the wedding arrived faster than Gabrielle Johnson expected. For months everything had been scheduled, confirmed, and organized. But now the final details were unfolding in real time. Family members were arriving in Tampa. Vendors were checking the venue layout. The rehearsal schedule had been finalized. Gabby spent most of her days moving between phone calls, meetings, and quick check-ins with the venue staff. Even though she trusted the team handling the logistics, part of her nature refused to completely step away from the process. Declan noticed it too. "You realize you're the bride now, right?" He joked one evening while watching her respond to messages on her tablet. Gabby looked up briefly. "I'm aware. You're allowed to relax." She gave him a playful look. "Relaxing is easier after the wedding happens." Declan laughed. Fair enough. Despite everything that had crossed her mind over the past few weeks, Gabby continued moving forward with the ceremony plans. The doubts she felt still didn't feel strong enough to challenge the relationship directly. Instead, she focused on what she could control. Then Declan decided to host a small gathering at his house a few nights before the wedding. "Just a few friends," he explained. "Nothing formal." Gabby agreed easily. It seemed like a normal pre-wedding moment. Friends gathering, sharing drinks, celebrating the upcoming ceremony. That evening, the house felt relaxed and lively. Soft music played from speakers in the living room, while several of Declan's friends talked near the kitchen island. Gabby arrived after finishing a late meeting with a florist. She stepped through the front door and paused for a moment to take in the scene. Several people greeted her warmly. "Gabby, there she is." She smiled and returned the greetings before setting her bag near the entryway. "Where's Declan?" she asked. Someone gestured toward the back patio. "Outside." Gabby nodded and walked down the hallway toward the sliding glass doors. Before she reached them, she heard voices drifting inside from the patio. Declan's voice was easy to recognize. "Everything is already planned." Another man laughed. "I still can't believe you're actually going through with it." Gabby slowed her steps. The tone of the conversation caught her attention immediately. She wasn't trying to listen, but the hallway carried sound clearly. Declan responded calmly. "It's already scheduled. Backing out now would create unnecessary problems." The other man chuckled again. "Still, marrying her?" Gabby felt a strange tension settle in her chest. A second voice spoke up. "Relax. Declan knows exactly what he's doing." Gabby's hand rested lightly against the wall as she stood there. Her instincts told her to keep walking, but curiosity held her in place. Outside on the patio, the conversation continued. One of the men lowered his voice slightly. "Man, I just hope you know how this looks." Declan replied quickly. "It looks exactly the way it's supposed to." A pause followed. Then Declan added something that sounded more serious. "This isn't the time to discuss it." The voices quieted for a moment. Gabby heard someone clear their throat. Then the first man spoke again, this time louder. "Well, I'll drink to the groom." Laughter followed. Gabby stepped forward quickly and pushed the sliding door open before the conversation could continue. Declan turned toward her immediately. His expression shifted from concentration to a warm smile. "There she is." Gabby returned the smile. "Sorry I'm late." Declan walked over and kissed her cheek. "Everything okay?" "Just busy." The other men greeted her politely, though Gabby noticed one of them avoided making direct eye contact for a second. She dismissed the detail for the moment. The evening moved on. Music played. People laughed. Drinks were poured. From the outside, it looked like a normal celebration, but the few sentences Gabby had heard earlier stayed quietly in the back of her mind. Later that night, after the guests had left and the house finally grew quiet, Gabby returned home. She stepped into her bedroom and sat down slowly at the edge of the bed. The room was silent. Her engagement ring caught the soft light from the bedside lamp. Gabby studied it carefully. For months, the ring had represented excitement and hope. Now, for the first time, it carried something else. A question, not a clear accusation, not a conclusion, just a quiet sense that something beneath the surface of her relationship might be shifting. She turned the ring gently around her finger. The wedding was only days away. Everyone around her believed she was about to begin the happiest chapter of her life. Gabby wanted to believe that too. But as she stared at the ring that night, a thought crossed her mind that she hadn't allowed herself to consider before. What if the story she thought she understood was missing something important? The room remained silent as the question settled into her thoughts, and outside, somewhere beyond the quiet streets of Tampa, the truth was moving closer to the moment when it would finally reveal itself, just days before the wedding. The morning of Gabrielle Johnson's wedding began with the kind of weather people describe as perfect. The Florida sun rose slowly over the water, casting a warm glow across the coastal venue where the ceremony would take place. Palm trees moved gently in the breeze, and the ocean stretched endlessly beyond the rows of white chairs arranged along the shoreline. Everything looked exactly the way Gabby had planned it. Every flower had been placed carefully. Every table aligned perfectly. Every detail matched the vision she had designed months earlier. By mid-morning, guests had already begun arriving. Some walked slowly along the garden paths near the venue, while others gathered near the entrance greeting friends they hadn't seen in years. Soft music floated through the air as staff members guided people toward their seats. Inside the bridal suite, laughter filled the room. Gabby stood near a large mirror, while several family members moved around her adjusting small details of her dress. "You look incredible," someone said behind her. Gabby smiled at her reflection. The dress was elegant without being overly dramatic. The fabric flowed softly toward the floor while the veil rested lightly across her shoulders. Another voice chimed in from across the room. "Declan about to forget how to breathe when he sees you." The room filled with laughter. Gabby laughed with them, though her voice remained calm. For most brides, the morning of the wedding came with nerves, excitement, maybe even a little panic, but Gabby felt surprisingly steady. Months of planning had prepared her for this day. Every detail had already been handled. All that remained now was the ceremony itself. Someone stepped closer to adjust the veil slightly. "You nervous?" they asked. Gabby thought about the question for a moment. Then she shook her head. Not really. The answer surprised even her, because despite the strange moments she had experienced over the past few weeks, something inside her still believed the day would unfold the way it was meant to. Across the venue, Declan Mercer stood in a private room with several of his closest friends. The atmosphere there felt very different from the bridal suite. While Gabby's side of the venue buzzed with laughter and excitement, Declan's room carried the relaxed energy of men celebrating before a major event. Several glasses sat on the table near the window. One of Declan's friends poured whiskey into them. "To Declan Mercer," he said, raising his glass. The others followed. "To the groom." Declan accepted the drink with a small smile. "You guys are acting like this is some kind of final mission." One of the men laughed. "Marriage is a serious operation." The group chuckled. Another man leaned back in his chair. "So, how you feeling?" Declan took a sip of the whiskey before answering. "Fine. Nervous?" Declan shook his head slightly. No, and for the most part, he meant it. From his perspective, everything was unfolding exactly as planned. The venue looked perfect. Guests were arriving. Within a short time, he would walk out to the altar and begin the next chapter of his life. One of the men leaned forward slightly. "Man, I still can't believe you're actually doing it." Declan glanced toward him. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man shrugged. "Just saying." Another voice spoke from the other side of the room. "Relax. Declan knows what he's doing." Declan remained quiet for a moment. He set the glass down on the table and looked toward the window where the ocean stretched across the horizon. Outside, guests were gathering for the ceremony. Everything appeared calm, perfect. But inside that room, the conversation was about to take a turn that would change everything. Inside the bridal suite, the energy remained lively. Laughter moved around the room as Gabrielle Johnson's family continued helping with the final details of her wedding dress. Someone adjusted the veil again. Someone else insisted the lighting near the mirror needed to be brighter for photos. Gabby appreciated the excitement, but after nearly 30 minutes inside the busy room, she felt the need for a moment of quiet. "I'm going to step outside for a minute," she said gently. A few people looked up. "You okay?" someone asked. Gabby smiled. "Just getting some air." No one questioned it. Wedding mornings often came with small emotional moments, and stepping away for a few minutes didn't seem unusual. Gabby slipped out of the suite and walked down the quiet hallway toward the garden entrance behind the venue. The difference in atmosphere was immediate. Outside, the air felt cooler. The breeze moved through the palm trees while the distant sound of waves rolled softly toward the shore. Gabby exhaled slowly. For the first time that morning, everything was quiet. She walked slowly along the side of the building, letting the calm settle her thoughts. The ceremony would begin soon, and in a short time she would be walking down the aisle. Her future felt close enough to touch. As she approached the corner of the building, she noticed something she hadn't expected. One of the windows was slightly open. Voices drifted out from inside the room. Male voices. She recognized one of them immediately. "Declan, Gabby paused. She hadn't intended to listen to anything private, but the voices carried clearly through the open window, and the tone of the conversation caught her attention. One of the men inside laughed. "Man, I still can't believe you pulled this off." Gabby frowned slightly. Declan's voice responded calmly. "Pulled what off?" Another man spoke. "You know exactly what we mean." There was a brief pause. Gabby felt a strange tension settle into her chest. Then someone else said something that made her freeze completely. "You really never loved her?" The silence that followed felt heavy. Gabby's heart began beating faster. Declan answered without hesitation, "No." The word landed with quiet certainty. Gabby stood completely still beside the window. For a moment her mind tried to reject what she had heard. Maybe the conversation wasn't about her. Maybe she misunderstood. Inside the room, one of the men let out a low whistle. "That woman worships you," Declan sighed. "Gabby's a good person." Another voice responded immediately. "Good enough to marry?" Gabby's fingers tightened against the wall beside her. Declan spoke again, his tone calm and practical. "You're missing the point," someone asked quietly. "Then what's the point?" Declan took a moment before answering. "Image." The word hung in the air. "People trust a man more when his life looks stable," he continued. "A respected businessman with a strong relationship. It reassures investors." Gabby felt something inside her chest shift. Not loudly, just quietly, like something fragile breaking without making a sound. Inside the room, one of the men laughed softly. "So this whole thing is about business?" Declan didn't deny it. "It helps," another man asked carefully. "And the other situation?" Gabby held her breath. Declan's response came calmly. "That stays private." "What about after the wedding?" someone asked. Declan took a breath. "We'll handle it later." "And the other woman, she understands the timeline." Gabby's heartbeat slowed, not because the words hurt less, but because clarity had suddenly replaced uncertainty. Inside the room, another voice spoke again. "And Gabby?" Declan picked up his drink before answering. "She doesn't need to know anything." For several seconds the world felt completely silent. The ocean breeze continued moving through the trees nearby. Guests laughed somewhere in the distance near the ceremony area. But for Gabby, everything felt strangely still. The man she was about to marry had just revealed the truth about their entire relationship. Not by accident, not during an argument, but casually, while drinking whiskey with friends. Gabby slowly stepped away from the window. Her mind replayed the conversation once more. Every sentence, every detail, every explanation that suddenly made the past few weeks make sense. The phone messages, the strange comments, the uneasy conversations she had overheard. It all connected now. Gabrielle Johnson stood quietly near the garden path, her wedding dress moving gently in the breeze. Her heart had been broken, but something else had happened at the same time. The confusion she had carried for weeks had disappeared. Now she understood exactly what Declan Mercer had been planning. And understanding brought something unexpected. Calm. Because once the truth finally reveals itself, you're free to decide what happens next. Gabrielle Johnson stood alone in the quiet garden beside the venue. The ocean breeze brushed lightly against the fabric of her wedding dress, and somewhere beyond the trees, guests continued arriving for the ceremony. Everything around her still looked perfect. White chairs lined the aisle, facing the water. Flowers framed the altar exactly the way she had designed it. Soft music drifted faintly through the air. The wedding she had planned so carefully was ready to begin, but the life she thought she was stepping into had just changed completely. Gabby closed her eyes for a moment. Inside her mind, the conversation she had overheard replayed with painful clarity. Declan's voice had been calm, measured, as if explaining a simple business decision. Image. The word echoed again. People trust a man more when his life looks stable. A respected businessman with a strong relationship. Gabby exhaled slowly. For several seconds she waited for the emotions she expected to feel. Shock, anger, tears, but none of them arrived the way she imagined. Instead, something else settled into place. Understanding. Declan Mercer had not proposed because he loved her. He had proposed because she fit a role. Gabby's reputation, her community connections, her successful event planning business, her warmth and credibility, all of it helped build the image he wanted the world to see. and she had almost walked straight into that role without ever realizing it. Gabby opened her eyes and looked down at the engagement ring on her finger. The diamond reflected the sunlight softly. For months that ring had represented hope. Now it simply represented information, a symbol of a decision someone else had made. Gabby turned the ring slowly around her finger. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled, not because the situation was funny, but because the answer had suddenly become very clear. Declan believed he was in control of the story. He believed the wedding was the final step in the image he had been constructing. But Declan Mercer had forgotten one important detail. Gabrielle Johnson understood people. She had spent years observing how emotions shape the most important moments in people's lives. Weddings, family gatherings, celebrations. She knew exactly how powerful those moments could be. And right now, hundreds of people were about to witness one. Gabby took another slow breath. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to panic. She didn't even need to cancel the wedding. Because sometimes the most powerful response to deception is patience. Gabby adjusted the edge of her veil and straightened the fabric of her dress. Her posture relaxed again. From the outside, nothing about her appearance suggested anything had changed. Anyone watching would have simply seen a bride taking a quiet moment before the ceremony. Gabby walked calmly back toward the entrance of the building. Inside the hallway, the sounds of preparation returned. Family members moving around, voices discussing last-minute details. One of the wedding coordinators spotted her immediately. "There you are," the woman said with relief. "We were just about to check on you." Gabby smiled. "I'm right here." The woman glanced at the clock. "Ceremony starts soon." "I know." Gabby stepped back into the bridal suite. The room immediately filled with excitement again. "There she is," someone said. "Gabby, you ready?" Gabby looked around the room. Her family members were smiling, laughing, adjusting their dresses. None of them had any idea what she had just discovered outside, and Gabby decided something in that moment. They wouldn't need to worry. Not yet. She stepped back toward the mirror while someone moved forward to fix the edge of her veil again. "You disappeared on us," one of them said. Gabby laughed softly. "Just needed a little air." "You nervous now?" Gabby looked at her reflection. For the first time that morning, she truly studied her own expression. The woman staring back at her looked calm, confident, composed, and she realized something surprising. She was ready, just not in the way everyone expected. Gabby touched the engagement ring once more. Then she lowered her hand. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'm ready," because the wedding was still going to happen. The ceremony would still begin. Guests would still gather along the ocean. Declan Mercer would still be standing at the altar waiting for his bride. The only difference was this. Gabrielle Johnson now knew the truth. And when the moment arrived, everyone else was going to learn it too. The ceremony began exactly on schedule. Soft music drifted across the oceanfront venue while guests settled into the rows of white chairs facing the water. The Florida sky stretched wide above them, and sunlight shimmered across the waves beyond the altar. It looked like the kind of wedding people describe as perfect. Flowers framed the aisle in gentle curves of white and soft green. The breeze moved through the decorations just enough to make everything feel alive. Guests spoke quietly while waiting for the ceremony to begin. Some held cameras. Others leaned toward each other, whispering about how beautiful the setting looked. At the front of the aisle, Declan Mercer stood near the altar adjusting the cuff of his jacket. He looked calm, confident. From his perspective, the day was unfolding exactly the way it should. Several of his friends stood nearby offering quiet congratulations. "Big moment," one of them said. Declan smiled slightly. "Looks that way. Ready?" Declan nodded. "I've been ready," and he believed that. Everything had followed the plan he had carefully constructed. A respected businessman, a beautiful wedding, a stable public image. Soon he would walk away from the ceremony with a reputation that would only grow stronger. The music shifted. Guests turned their attention toward the entrance of the aisle. The ceremony was beginning. Inside the bridal suite, Gabrielle Johnson stood near the door. The room had grown quiet now that the moment had finally arrived. Her wedding dress moved softly as she stepped forward. Someone adjusted the edge of her veil one final time. "You look incredible," a voice said. Gabby smiled gently. "Thank you." Despite everything she had heard earlier that morning, her expression remained calm, her posture steady. There were no visible signs of the truth she now carried. From the outside, she looked exactly like the bride everyone expected to see. The music outside grew louder. Gabby stepped toward the entrance. The doors opened. The ocean breeze drifted gently through the ceremony space as she appeared at the start of the aisle. For a brief moment, the entire crowd seemed to pause. Guests turned toward her. Several smiles appeared immediately. Gabby walked forward slowly. Each step was graceful, measured. The sunlight caught the edges of her dress as she moved between the rows of chairs. Declan looked up from the altar. For the first time that morning, something in his expression softened, because despite everything else he had planned, one thing remained true. Gabrielle Johnson looked radiant. The guests admired the couple quietly as Gabby approached. Some whispered about how beautiful the moment felt. Others simply watched the bride walk toward the man waiting at the altar. From the outside, nothing about the scene suggested anything unusual. But inside Gabby's mind, the conversation she had overheard earlier repeated clearly. I never loved her. People trust a man more when his life looks stable. She doesn't need to know anything. Gabby continued walking forward. Each sentence echoed once more before fading into the background of her thoughts. By the time she reached the altar, her decision felt completely solid. Declan smiled as she stepped beside him. You look amazing, he whispered quietly. Gabby returned a small smile. Thank you. Guests settled into silence as the officiant prepared to begin the ceremony. Everything looked exactly the way a wedding ceremony should. But what none of the guests realized was that the most important part of the ceremony hadn't happened yet. And when it did, the entire room would remember this wedding forever. The ocean breeze moved softly through the ceremony space as everyone settled into silence. The officiant stepped forward with a warm smile, looking at Gabrielle Johnson and Declan Mercer standing before him. We are gathered here today, he began, to celebrate the union of two people who have chosen to build a life together. Guests listened quietly. Some held phones ready to capture the moment. Others leaned slightly toward the aisle, watching the couple with admiration. From the outside, it looked like any beautiful wedding ceremony. Gabby stood calmly beside Declan, her hands resting lightly in his. Declan glanced toward her with the confident expression he had worn all morning. Everything still appeared to be unfolding according to his expectations. The officiant continued speaking about love, commitment, and the promise two people make when they choose to share their lives. Gabby listened to every word, not because the speech moved her emotionally, but because each sentence reminded her of the truth she had discovered only a short time earlier. Promises meant something, but only when both people intended to honor them. Eventually, the officiant reached the moment everyone had been waiting for. He turned toward Declan. Declan Mercer, he said warmly, do you take Gabrielle Johnson to be your wife? To love and support her, to stand beside her through every chapter of life? Declan didn't hesitate. I do. Several guests smiled immediately. A few people even wiped tears from their eyes. To them, the moment looked like the beginning of something beautiful. Then the officiant turned toward Gabby. And Gabrielle Johnson, he said, do you take Declan Mercer to be your husband, to share your life with him in love, trust, and partnership? Gabby looked at Declan. For a brief moment, the two of them simply held each other's gaze. Declan waited confidently. He had no reason to expect anything different. But Gabby didn't answer right away. The silence stretched slightly longer than expected. Some guests shifted in their seats. The officiant waited patiently. Gabby took a slow breath. Then she spoke. I have something I need to say first. The officiant blinked in surprise but stepped back slightly. Declan's expression changed immediately. What's wrong? He whispered quietly. Gabby turned her gaze away from him and looked out toward the crowd. Dozens of faces were watching her. Friends, family members, business associates, everyone who had gathered to witness what they believed was a joyful moment. Gabby's voice remained calm. About 20 minutes before the ceremony, she began. I stepped outside to get some air. The guests listened closely now, and while I was outside, she continued, I heard a conversation. Declan's body stiffened beside her. Gabby turned back toward him. You were in a room with your friends. A quiet ripple moved through the audience. Gabby spoke clearly so everyone could hear. One of them asked you a question. Declan's face had begun losing color. Gabby repeated the words exactly as she had heard them. They asked you, you really never loved her? The entire venue fell silent. Gabby paused only long enough to let the sentence settle in the air. Then she continued, "And your answer was simple." She looked directly at Declan. "You said no." Gasps moved through the audience. Someone near the front covered their mouth in shock. Declan tried to speak. "Gabby, this isn't—" She lifted her hand gently. "Please let me finish." Her voice remained steady. "You also explained something else," she said. Gabby turned slightly so the entire crowd could hear. "You said people trust a man more when his life looks stable." More whispers moved through the chairs. "You said marrying me would help your public image." Declan's breathing had grown tight. "Gabby, we can talk about this privately." "No," she replied calmly. Her eyes returned to his. "There's only one question that matters now." The room felt completely still. Gabby asked it without raising her voice. "Is it true?" Declan opened his mouth, then closed it again. For a moment, he searched the faces around him. His friends, his business associates, Gabby, everyone waiting for him to respond. That hesitation lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough, because silence can reveal the truth just as clearly as words. Gabby nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." The wedding guests remained frozen in stunned disbelief. The ceremony they had arrived to celebrate had just turned into something no one expected, and the most important moment was still coming next. For several seconds after Gabrielle Johnson asked her question, the entire venue remained completely silent. The ocean waves rolled softly in the distance. Palm leaves moved gently in the breeze. But among the guests seated along the aisle, no one spoke. All eyes were fixed on the couple standing at the altar. Declan Mercer still hadn't answered. His expression had changed completely now. The confident calm he carried earlier had vanished, replaced by something far less controlled. He looked toward Gabby again. "Gabby, listen," he said quietly. "We can talk about this." But Gabby didn't move. She studied him calmly, the same way she had studied people her entire life. In that moment, she wasn't searching for explanations anymore. She already had the truth. The hesitation, the silence, the way Declan avoided saying the one word that could have defended him. It told her everything she needed to know. Gabby lowered her gaze briefly toward the ring on her finger. The diamond caught the sunlight just as it had earlier that morning when she stood in front of the mirror in the bridal suite. For months it had represented a promise. Now it simply represented a decision that had been built on deception. Gabby gently removed the ring from her finger. The movement was slow enough that several guests noticed immediately. A quiet murmur moved through the chairs. Declan watched her closely. "Gabby," he said urgently, but she didn't stop. She held the ring in her hand for a moment, studying it one last time. Then she stepped forward and placed it into Declan's palm. The metal touched his hand softly. "This ring represents love," she said calmly. Her voice carried clearly through the quiet ceremony space. "But love should never be built on deception." Declan's fingers closed slowly around the ring. "Please," he said, lowering his voice. "Don't do this here." Gabby looked at him steadily. Where else should the truth be told? Several guests shifted in their seats. Some looked shocked. Others looked angry. Gabby spoke again, her voice still measured and composed. "You asked me to marry you because I helped complete an image you wanted the world to see." Declan's shoulders tightened. "You believed my reputation, my community connections, and my work would make you look like a man people could trust." No one in the audience interrupted. They were too stunned. Gabby continued, "But a marriage built on strategy isn't a marriage." She paused briefly before adding the final sentence. "It's a performance." Declan looked around the ceremony space, realizing too late that the audience he once hoped would admire him was now witnessing something very different. His carefully planned image had collapsed in front of everyone who mattered. Gabby took one small step backward. "Sorry doesn't fix a heart you tried to use." The words hung in the air with quiet finality. Then, Gabrielle Johnson turned away from the altar. Her dress moved softly as she stepped back toward the aisle. For a moment, no one moved. Guests simply watched as the bride who had walked toward the altar only minutes earlier now walked away from it. Alone, but her posture remained strong, confident. She didn't rush. She didn't look back. Each step carried the same calm dignity she had shown from the beginning. Somewhere near the front row, someone whispered softly, "That woman just saved herself." Gabby continued walking. Declan remained frozen at the altar, the engagement ring still resting in his hand. The future he had expected only minutes earlier had disappeared. His reputation, the one he had tried to protect so carefully, had just been exposed in front of every witness who mattered. By the time Gabby reached the end of the aisle, the ocean breeze caught the edge of her veil and lifted it gently behind her. She paused briefly near the entrance of the venue, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood something important. Some people believe the strongest revenge comes from hurting someone the way they hurt you. But sometimes the most powerful response is something much simpler: walking away. Gabrielle Johnson stepped forward into the sunlight beyond the ceremony space. Behind her, the wedding that was supposed to celebrate a beginning had become something else entirely. A lesson, because love should never require someone to become part of another person's strategy, and anyone who sees your heart as a tool was never worthy of it in the first place. If this story moved you, let me ask you something real. What would you have done if you were standing in Gabby's place? Would you have walked away quietly? Or would you have exposed the truth the way she did? Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. And if this story reminded you that self-respect should always come before love, share it with someone who might need that reminder today. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Graham's Stories for more real stories about love, life, and the moments that change everything.
Thank you for watching Mr. Graham's Stories, my beautiful, amazing family.